Hey world civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you today, and we're going to be looking at worldwide economic struggles in the interwar period. Basically, this is a fancy way of saying we're going to look at economic problems and the Great Depression between World War I and World War II. Here are our video goals for today. We want to look at what economic troubles faced Germany after World War I and also look at how they overcame them, albeit temporarily. We want to find out what the Great Depression was, and more importantly, how countries responded to the Great Depression. Take a look at our vocabulary. We will need to make sure we understand what all these terms are by the end of the video. So let's start with economic troubles that faced Germany after World War I. Keep in mind that Germany had to pay the equivalent of something like $500 billion in today's money as reparations for the war. And they began paying these in 1921. Understandably, this caused severe financial problems, and these were evident, by the next year. France, in response to Germany stopping their payments, decides to occupy a part of Germany called the Ruhr Valley. And so they took over the mines and factories there in order to try to make some of the money that reparations should be sending their way. And so this was kind of controversial. It was certainly not ideal in what everyone wanted to be a peaceful world. Germany dealt with some of their problems and the inflation that was starting in Germany. They dealt with it by printing more money. But hopefully you know, or maybe you'll know now, that printing more money does not solve financial problems. In fact, it makes the money that's already out there worth much less. So pretty soon the German mark, which was their form of the dollar, was pretty much worthless, and inflation ran absolutely wild. In 1914, when World War I started, it took 4.2 marks to make 1 US dollar. So basically a mark was about equal to a quarter. By 1923, it took 120 billion marks to every US dollar. And by the end of that year, it was something like 1 trillion. So it basically was simply worthless. In fact, in this image, you can see a woman burning her worthless money for heat because it just simply won't buy anything. The note that you see at the bottom there is a 50 million mark note. But as we know, by the end of 1923, that would not even be worth $1. There are also other stories. For example, people getting paid and having to carry their pay home in wheelbarrows because they had so many of these mark notes, but they were worthless. So they were paid so many more, and it would just what have you. There's another story, whether true or not, I think it's a funny story, that a woman was paid and had her money in a giant bucket outside her house and just left and left it there. And when she came back, the money was still there, but the bucket was missing because the bucket was more valuable than the currency. But these economic troubles, of course, are going to lead to political troubles as well in Germany. So the world kind of gets together, and some people in the United States come up with a plan to help Germany. And this becomes known as the Dawes Plan. And it basically reduced reparations and planned out how Germany could pay back these other nations. It also provided loans from American banks to Germany to help them through the situation. And you see here to the right the Dawes Plan. Basically, the Allies owed a lot of money to the United States. The United States then provided a lot of loans to Germany, who in turn could pay back the Allies. So this was the plan to kind of help Germany through the situation. And so it leads to a brief period of recovery and prosperity in Germany in the latter half of the 1920s. In addition to this, Germany and France ended up signing the Treaty of Locarno, which settled their western border disputes, and Germany even joins the League of Nations. And later, 63 nations decide to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. So these are all things that were pointing to kind of what might be a really good situation in the world. They had overcome some problems by the end of the 1920s, a decade after the war. Oh man, things are looking good. But that prosperity is going to be short-lived. And the reason being is because on the horizon is the Great Depression. Now, depression is a period of low economic activity and rising unemployment in a nation. And usually it's kind of for a prolonged time period. The Great Depression, with capital G, capital D here, begins in the United States and it will spread worldwide. And there are several major causes which you need to know. First of all, there are several downturns in the economies of individual nations. So just struggles as demand goes down for certain goods, and so people are not buying as much. And if people are not buying as much, then that might lead to a company cutting jobs and more people becoming out of work. Secondly, agricultural overproduction, especially of wheat, causes falling prices in the United States and in other nations. And so farmers are not able to get the prices they need for their agricultural products. And when this happens, that can cause an even greater struggle, as now the farmers don't have enough money to buy the things they need, and becomes a chain reaction. But the big monumental event that causes this Great Depression is the crash of the United States stock market in 1929. So the United States had kind of believed in this stock market and that it was going to keep going up and up and up and up. And then finally, it tumbles. And so the U.S. economy crashes. And U.S. investors then, in order to try to gain some money back and help themselves out over here in the U.S., withdraw their investments from Germany and other European states. And because these investments are withdrawn, those nations become weakened. Major banks collapse in several countries, including the United States. People make a run on banks and try to get all their money out, and they basically can't. And as a result of this, we see all these nations trying to take measures to fix the problem. And so trade decreases between nations as they try to, instead of importing goods from other countries, they try to make them at home. Production is going to decline because people don't have the money to buy these goods, and unemployment is going to rise. All of these things combined really make the Great Depression the worst depression in history, or in our recent history. So what were some of the responses to the Great Depression? Well, for the most part, countries in Europe and the United States had experienced depressions before, but they had never experienced one quite as bad as this. And so governments didn't know how to deal with this crisis. They try to cut costs, they try to raise tariffs to encourage goods being made within their countries, but that only makes the economic crisis worse. So governments then begin to increase economic regulation. And this can be seen in the United States as FDR passes or puts through the New Deal and creates policies for regulation of businesses, etc. And this was a big change because, for the most part, many of these European nations and the United States had practiced a hands-off, laissez-faire policy. There was also in these countries a renewed interest in those Marxist ideals of communism. And so these Marxist doctrines came about or were especially championed by workers and intellectuals who hoped that this would create a more equal society and solve the financial crisis. And in some countries like Italy and Germany and Argentina and Brazil, masses of people begin to follow political leaders who offer very simple solutions in return for a lot of power. And this is seen with Mussolini and Hitler especially. So what of these democratic states after World War I? How did they deal with this crisis and what was happening? So in the 1920s, keep in mind, Europe seemed to be returning to trends of parliamentary democracies and the growth of individual liberties. They kind of passed this time period of kings and chancellors and hugely large, powerful leaders. And that journey was not an easy process. For example, in Germany, the Weimar Republic, you see the ensign of it there, faced a lack of leadership. They didn't have really strong political leaders, and of course, all these economic problems. Germany was hit hardest by the Depression. In France, they also had many problems from this Great Depression. In fact, they had several reforms that were pushed by communists, socialists, and radicals in their country. They formed 6 different cabinets trying to solve economic issues. And so it really leads to a crisis of confidence in those governments. In Great Britain, the party in charge, the Labour Party, fell out of favor, and the Conservatives come into power in Britain. They try to balance the budget, they set up protective tariffs, and try to wait out this depression. But the one you might be most familiar with is the United States. Whereas industrial production fell by 50% and unemployment skyrocketed to about 12 million people, the United States turned to a Democratic president, Franklin Roosevelt, who set up a program of government intervention. And this was known as the New Deal. It put people to work and established a welfare system, it established a social security system, it established bank holidays, and it set up insurance for the elderly. It set up bank insurance to protect people's money in the banks. So the FDIC, which insured everyone's money up to, I think nowadays it's like $200,000 or something along those lines. But this was to get people more confident in the government and to put people to work. That was the big idea. And so they actually spent more money than the U.S. had in its treasury. It was called deficit spending. We may talk more about that in the future. So these all kind of alleviated the pressure in the United States from the Great Depression, but it would really take World War II to pull the United States out of the Depression completely. So the New Deal does not end the Great Depression, but it kind of gets the U.S. through it. When World War II breaks out, production in the United States will begin to grow again, and the United States will exit World War II along with many other nations. Exit the Great Depression, excuse me. Here are your video goals. Make sure you get them, and have a good day.